Hi, everybody, and welcome to our first virtual meeting of the New York Society for General Semantics. Not our first meeting of 2020, but our first post-pandemic meeting. And while it would have been nice to actually be together, and I remember Doug Rushkoff talking about the word conspire meaning to breathe the same air. And that suddenly has a different sense to it nowadays than it used to have. So while we regret not being able to be together and greet each other in person, we are at least fortunate that we can have this means of communicating and virtually getting together. And it also gives us a chance to connect with so many other people from all around the country and overseas, all the way over to Canada, because New York, after all, is global in its orientation, and there are many people who are connected to the New York Society who are outside of New York or even New Jersey or Connecticut. So we welcome you all. Welcome especially to those of you connecting to us for the first time. And let me explain, first of all, that the New York Society for General Semantics is a venerable institution. We bring these programs to you. We don't ask for any membership fee or registration fee for doing that. Although I will note that on our website you can leave a donation if you're so inclined. But otherwise, we recommend that people join the Institute of General Semantics, and that is a very reasonable kind of fee of $50 for an annual membership, $25 for students. And among the perks of that membership is a subscription to the journal, etc., venerable journal. Tom, you have to hold it against your body, Tom. Tom, say something.
This is the latest issue of Etc., just out 2 weeks ago, double issue.
And Tom is the editor of Etc., so you know it's got to be good. So anyway, we encourage you all to go to the website of the Institute of General Semantics and become a member of the IGS. And again, we're happy to have you all here. I know that, well, in the spirit of non-allness, I won't say that we're all on the edge of our seats and nervous wrecks at this moment in time, but whoever isn't has probably got a drinking problem or some other kind of issue. And so we find ourselves, what better way to spend some time than to actually get out of the sort of cable news bubble or whatever other bubbles, the Facebook, Instagram, Twitter bubble, and into our nice little bubble here at the New York Society. And so we have our session tonight, our program that is entitled The Election and the Semantic Environment. And let me just introduce the program and then our participants. And I'll just go over the description that you may have read it, but maybe you didn't. But anyway, for posterity, Alfred Korzybski's initial impulse in formulating his non-Aristotelian system of general semantics was to address political concerns related to peace and justice. He hoped to find a way for us to make the same kind of progress in human relations that we've been able to make in science and technology, and his concerns were shared by many others who embrace general semantics, including the economist and social theorist Stuart Chase, who you may know coined the term the New Deal for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The peace and conflict studies pioneer Anatol Rapoport, who I know our Canadian friends are very proud of because he was one of their own, and cultural critic Neil Postman, who was a mentor to some of us as well. The 2020 US presidential election has often been referred to as the most consequential of our time, if not of the entirety of American history. Without a doubt, it seems that American society and polity is in the midst of a major crisis, one that may well determine the future of democracy in the US, and that this election will be pivotal in deciding the direction we'll take as we face the challenges of a global pandemic, economic collapse, disastrous climate change, international conflict, and geopolitical realignment, etc. In the midst of all this, we find ourselves in a semantic environment characterized by extreme polarization and a dangerous degree of semantic pollution of the sort that Neil Postman referred to as crazy talk and stupid talk. So with Election Day almost here, rather than hearing the same stuff over and over, we are going to engage in a panel discussion informed by non-Aristotelian perspectives featuring the following participants. I introduce you in alphabetical order. Susan Drucker, professor in the Department of Journalism and Media Studies, the School of Communication at Hofstra University, a university that's almost synonymous with presidential politics, I might add, or presidential assessment. Salvador Falica, who studied under Neil Postman and Terry Moran, currently teaches courses in propaganda and spectacle culture in the Department of Media Culture and Communication at New York University. Tom Gencarelli, professor of communication at Manhattan College, as well as a board member of the New York Society and a trustee of the Institute of General Semantics. And by the way, did I mention he's editor of etc.? Did I mention that? Catherine Leepa Levinson, member of the New York Society Board of Directors and a former member of the Colgate University's theater program on the faculty there, and a professional photographer and art photographer whose work has been featured on journal, magazine covers, regularly exhibited in a variety of shows. Mike Plew, professor of communication at Manhattan College, vice president-elect of the Media Ecology Association, and a member of the New York Society Board. And yours truly, Lance Strait, president of the New York Society, trustee of the Institute of General Semantics, and professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University. So we're all here together. I shortened their bios, so we'll have time to actually talk. But you can read them online, and I'm very happy to turn this over now. I've asked each of our participants to start off with just some short comments about what their thinking is right at this moment, and we can take it from there. I want to note to our audience that if you look at the various control functions, if you're not familiar with this format, you'll see one that says Q&A, and that is where you can type questions for the participants, and we'll start off with some discussion and then move to a Q&A session with the participants. You, of course, can also leave any kind of comment in the chat box. Remember that if it just says all panelists, it only goes to us. Leave it for everyone, it's all panelists and attendees, and rude comments will not be Well, we'll hurt our feelings.
They'll also be recorded.
Yes, and we know where you live. So let me start off, and and we can proceed in that alphabetical order, which I still remember about. So, Susan, would you like to start us off?
Sure, I will. First of all, I want to thank Lance for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here, wherever here is, although I do confess to missing the Players Club. I realize that with Lance's invitation that I'm actually rather superstitious. I was on a panel that was sponsored by the same organization, September 9th, 2016.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. And the longest 4 years ago, I think, in recorded history, certainly in my life. And I remembered having a conversation about the election and the semantic environment. And we were optimistic, if not confident, that the debasement of language, the profanity-filled environment, the daily harangue that was coming from then candidate Trump was going to end in November. And it didn't. And so now we have been living in a time that Lance mentioned Neil Postman. We're living in a time that brings me back to one of my favorite titles of Neil's, which was Amusing Ourselves to Death. And we have taken that to a point where it is literally, we are amusing ourselves to death. I feel as if we've spent the last 4 years in some kind of a Twilight Zone episode. I'm not quite sure which one. I know that there's the one that really comes to mind is It's a Good Life, where there's a 6-year-old little evil boy that basically has control of his entire town, that you do not cross the evil little boy. There's, there are others. That was The Good Life. There was the episode, do you remember the one with Hitler's Ghost? And what was the name of that one? Anyway, so you have Hitler returning. He's alive. That was the title of it. And then the other one is In the Eye of the Beholder, which is one of my favorites, which has to do with intolerance and standards of acceptance and beauty in a authoritarian environment. So I keep coming back to the Twilight Zone. I'll just make a couple of quick comments and then come back to some of the other points I'd like to make. Other than the Twilight Zone, what I realize is that there are certain words that I've become fixated on over the last 4 years. I was sitting in a little village in France as President Trump put his little hand on the Bible. And the word that crossed my mind when I was safe in that little village was treason. And that's a word that I keep returning to. So the definition of treason is something that has underscored the semantic environment. I look at behavior in terms of whether it's levying war against an enemy or giving aid and comfort to an enemy. Apparently others have used that word over the course of the past 4 years to levy allegations against anybody that they don't agree with. President Trump has accused 9 people of treason in recent weeks, including his predecessor, Adam Schiff, the whistleblower, the former head of the FBI, the present head of the FBI, among others. So just the concept of how words with legal consequence are being used in this environment is something that has concerned me. And a word like treason being thrown around has been of great import to me. There are other words I want to talk about, including the emoluments. I mean, I think that there are words that we have not had to think about that are now kind of in the foreground of our thinking and of litigation and of where we are and where we're going. And I'll get to some of the other words and issues that I have a bit later on, but I'll just start out with that I think, as President Obama said last week, this is not normal. And I think we need to look at some of the words and the language that we have become accustomed to using, words that are being thrown about contrary to their definition, words that have, like I said, legal import, that are being used inappropriately. All of that, I think, we need to be evaluating as we try to grapple with our own twilight zone.
Thank you, Sue. And I forgot to mention when I was introducing you that Susan Drucker is also an attorney. So when she's talking legal import, she knows whereof she speaks. We'll turn now to Sal Felica.
Thank you, Lance. And thank you for inviting me. And good evening, everyone. Good to see all of you, at least virtually. I was struck by something that Susan said, when former President Obama says this is not normal. Well, to a certain extent, it's an extension of what's been happening over time. What's happened is we've normalized this kind of behavior, especially from the right wing, especially from the Republicans. I'll just be quite honest with you. I'm probably, pretty much an ideological liberal, so you can take my remarks from that point. But I think when we say that the semantic environment has been degraded and is in the process of becoming incredibly unbalanced, I think we could look to the most recent bit of political communication, if you want to call it that, the presidential debates. I mean, and I'll just provide an overview. The first one was incredibly chaotic. But I think we have to understand something, that chaos was the strategy. The interruption by Trump was a strategy, because one of the things the right wing likes to do in this country is to forestall thought, or forestall complete thought. And so one of the things that Trump did in that first debate was constantly interrupt. You saw a real degradation of that particular political genre because the moderator had no ability to either shut him up or to moderate the debate so that it became somewhat of a instructive moment for the American public. The second debate was called off, and one of the more interesting things was they both had town halls on different channels. Probably a step up, right? But that we can talk about a little bit later. But the third debate was praised to high heavens among the press. But I mean, anybody who's studied any kind of debate or looked at the debates over the last 20, 30 years or so, it was mediocre. The fact that the moderator could mute one of the participants, and then the discussion could go on, proved to be a step up. So in a sense, what we've done is we've normalized bad behavior, bad semantic behavior. And I think that that's, one of the things that we're going to have to work on. I mean, as the academy has to work on it, and also the news, the journalism class, the journalism industry has to work on, and of course, politicians have to work on it. So I'll just stop here, and we can move on.
Clearly a lot of work to do. Thank you, Sal. Well, following from F to G, we have Tom Gencarelli. I don't know if I mentioned that he's editor of Etc. or not, but he is. Tom?
Just in response to Sal's remarks, I want to point out that the strategy in the first debate was to keep on interrupting Biden so that he would start to stutter.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Meantime, there's so much to say, and I thought about what could I offer as remarks and offer as remarks in terms of general semantics. But let me start with a little story, and actually, Sue's remarks made me think of this too. That back in 2016, in those halcyon days, I was invited to a party on election night. And I was invited by a woman who was a good friend of my wife, and a bunch of their women friends. We're getting together because they were going to celebrate the election of the first woman president. Now, along the campaign season, when Hillary got the nod, I'm thinking to myself, we're not that progressive a country, that we just came off of 8 years of having a president who was a person of color, which deeply disturbed a great number of people in the country. And Hillary she had some baggage herself, but she had the additional baggage of her husband. And so there were folks who really, really disliked her and were against her. And so, I'm thinking to myself, well, this is still in play, folks. And then the Republican National Convention happened, and Donald Trump was the nominee. And I said, okay, we're going to have the first woman president. There we go. So I go to this party, and the woman who held the party made a cake. Do you know how you can make those cakes where you take a photograph of someone and make the icing out of their photograph? So she made this, and there it was, place of honor at the center of the table. And you all remember the night. The party basically turned to a funeral by about, I'm going to say 8:45. And point of story, she still has the cake under glass. It's kind of like the experiment with the Twinkie that these high school kids have somewhere, where, how long will a Twinkie actually last? How, much is it edible food, and, what's its half-life, right? She still has the cake. So having said that, as Lance mentioned, I am the editor of Etc., the latest issue, but I'm not going to do a pitch for Etc. because Lance has already done us that favor. What I want to refer to is the previous double issue, right, in which Corey Anton wrote a piece called Responding to Hypocrisy, Getting a Handle on Its Abundance and Its Apparent Irrelevance. And let me read a paragraph from his article. Like religion, politics is largely about well-known interests and collectively shared aspirations. And for that reason, the world of politics is drenched in hypocrisy. The 2016 political campaign witnessed hypocrisy at almost all turns, and the hypocrisy machine rolls on today. For example, some people celebrate Donald Trump for knowing how to work the system, how to use bankruptcies as bailouts, and how to avoid paying certain taxes. But many of these same folks complain about people on welfare. Presumably, neither Trump nor welfare recipients are breaking the law. Trump's sexual escapades and profanity are whitewashed by Republicans as they, in a yeah, but what about turn, indict Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton. When Obama was in office, a national poll revealed that only 30% of white evangelists said they could forgive a president's immoral behavior. Now under Trump, it is up to 70%. During recent reporting on the Florida high school shooting, there were Republican senators who, after having taken many thousands of dollars from the National Rifle Association, accused student protesters of being paid to protest. Hillary Clinton, gotta be fair here, Hillary Clinton says she speaks for people's interests, and yet she remains unwilling to release the transcripts of speeches she gave to Wall Street. Many of the folks who had been chanting, "Lock her up," as their response to Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server for official government business, suddenly have nothing to say in response to Jared Kushner's transgressions of the same. People who are quick to criticize the Clinton Foundation for pay-to-play politics have now grown silent in response to Trump's alleged similar behavior. So, I read this and I started to think about the nature of hypocrisy and of contradiction. Let me talk about contradiction first for just a moment, right? So language, our language requires us to be internally consistent as we make our points, as we make our arguments. This is one of the ways in which our arguments, our logic, our reason can be picked upon, say in a debate, if we're not internally consistent. And so what I want to say in talking about both words and using both of them together is, well, hypocrisy is contradiction writ large. I also want to add to this another book, if you can see it, right? Jacques Ellul. And talk about the idea of the propaganda playbook of authoritarians and demagogues, the dirty tricks of political operatives in the service of propaganda and what we're seeing going on right now. And also, because we really need to speak to it, the differences between the Republican Party of today and the Democratic Party, or maybe I should say it this way. Why don't we call it the Republic Party? Because the Democrat Party seems to have become an epithet among the right, right? Neither is a paragon of virtue. Neoliberalism has killed the Democratic Party and what it once represented, what it maintains that it represents, and the people who it maintains it represents. But with respect to hypocrisy, you've got what just happened with the appointment of a Supreme Court justice. And you've also got, and maybe another important concept here is the idea of projection too, right? But you've got voter fraud allegations coming from one side. You've got gerrymandering practices coming from one side. You've got voter ID laws, right? If you live in a state and you don't drive, and thus you don't have a driver's license, where is your photo ID? And if you're a person who, doesn't drive and doesn't necessarily have the money to spend to buy a driver's license for no particular reason other than in order to vote, to prove this is who I am, right? What's going on with those practices and this argument? What I see happening across the board is that there's a party, it seems, that, again, while I can hold them both in contempt in all kinds of ways and for all kinds of reasons, I'm looking at a party that more and more seems to have become a party that knows that its power is collapsing and that the only way to maintain power is through propaganda, is through the enacting of dirty tricks, and is through presenting the ultimate of hypocritical statements and ideas and point of views. And Corey and I don't know how this is acceptable by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, but what do you really think, Tom?
It's
By the way, did I mention he's the editor of Etc.? Yeah. Okay. And that's a great article. And they can, by the way, back issues are available as are individual articles, I believe. And in fact, I think if you sign up, is it the same year as now? Is it the same or last year?
Yeah, we're getting close.
Well, no, I'm just saying we could send you that issue as well. So let's turn now to Kathy and hear what she has to say. Take it away, Kathy.
You have to unmute yourself.
Unmute. Unmute. You're muted.
Hi. Okay, great. Can everybody hear? Are we good? Okay. As Lance noted, I have a background in theater, and I have always been very interested as a general semanticist in the narrative aspect of time binding and how important that is. And it's reared up in this particular election cycle because we have seen so many narratives from the past that continue to dog our democracy, whether it's institutionalized racism, income inequality, just what the concept of democracy is, and so forth and so on. But I have to say, for this particular election cycle, like the very first speaker, I am absolutely obsessed. I am haunted by one particular narrative, and that is election rigging. Election rigging. It's interesting that election rigging has loomed large on both the Democratic and the Republican sides for the 2016 election. And of course, now it has come down to us in this 2020 election with a president of the United States basically stating that if he loses the election is in fact rigged. Well, the interesting thing for me about time binding as a general semanticist is that time binding is not just simply received wisdom or information. Time binding for a general semanticist is always considered with other formulations. It's always in tension with other formulations so that we can figure out if we want to adjust it, throw it out, or remake it. So I thought it would be interesting to look at all the times we have been using the words rigged. Not all of them, but a lot of the times we have been using the words rigged in the 2016 election and to see how they were different. So if you're looking at the formulation of indexing, that would mean rigged election 1 is not rigged election 2 is not rigged election 3. So here are some examples, and these are from the 2016 election. Rigged election was applied to what was called clearing the field of candidates for Hillary Clinton. By the way, I was a Hillary Clinton supporter. I'm just saying that, to be fair, you have to discuss everything. So to clear the field of candidates made it a rigged primary because it really only ended up her plus 2 other candidates for a long time. And many people thought this was unfair, and it was referred to as rigged. Many of you know that the whole issue of the superdelegate system was considered rigged. Some people, the more liberal people, considered the whole caucus system rigged because instead of primaries, because only a few people ended up showing up, and it did not result in the vote by the majority. The Russian disinformation movement was rigged. Comey's letter was rigged, and so forth. And now on the Republican side, you have Trump complaining that the Republicans actually rigged that primary because they were not giving him enough delegates for his individual wins. He also used the word rigged for the FBI. The FBI was rigged because they did not indict Clinton over the emails. And then, of course, Trump loudly, very, very loudly complained for Bernie Sanders that Bernie Sanders' primary was rigged and Democrats should be very upset about this. And he also said, again, in 2016, that if he lost the election, it was because the election was rigged. Interestingly enough, Trump, of course, has bragged that he was a trailblazer and he was the first one to coin the term rigged in terms of election. But Fact Checkers gives a list of other firsts in that regard. They suggest that Trump borrowed the word first from Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders has used it not for the election cycles per se, which of course he did, but even much earlier than that, to talk about government systems that create income inequality and continue to feed income inequality. It also became then a staple of the Sanders campaign long before Trump took up the mantra saying that the whole Democratic election process was rigged and the Clinton win was rigged as well. And Sanders supporters use that term themselves. Fact Checkers also points out that many other politicians through the years have used the term rigged. I'm only going to bring up two. 1992, Jerry Brown used the word rigged for Super Tuesday because he said that it gave the southern states an unfair advantage over the other states, and therefore the democratic process was also rigged. And in 2012, Elizabeth Warren came out and against the money that the corporations were feeding into the elections and said that people are feeling this system is totally rigged against them. So fast forward to what we have now. Trump has managed to truly weaponize the words rigged election. He's complained against the media, witch hunt, rigged. He's complained that impeachment was used, witch hunt, rigged. And if he doesn't get elected, probably the most heinous one again, since he's president in control of all the resources, that if he does not get elected, the election, in fact, was rigged. Interestingly enough, and I have been having nightmares over this election cycle too, but interestingly enough, the word rigged is not that prevalent among Democratic volunteers and pundits and media. They are not using rigged towards fellow Democrats or even really towards Trump. Now, this is I think to me, this is a very important issue, and I'm very grateful because the word rigged is extremely general. It does not specify clear goals with which we can solve a problem. So I think most of you know that in 2016, unfortunately, depending on whose side you're on, 12% of Bernie voters actually voted for Trump. So I encourage all of us to continue on talking about voter suppression, which is specific, income inequality, which is specific, institutional racism, which is specific, and all of those different ways, I think, have energized the Democratic base in a very, very different way.
Thank you, Kathy. And her comments were in no way rigged. I deny any allegations
Yes,
to
they
that
were.
effect. And we turn now to Mike Plew.
Man, I feel like the only thing I need to say is a very deep sigh at this point. That might just say everything. As the conversation has proceeded, it's gotten increasingly heavy. I mean, each one of us is focused on something quite different and quite troubling about the present semantic environment. And, I think we could probably add layer upon layer upon layer, and we wouldn't scratch the surface at this point. One of the things that struck me from Sue's comments was the talk of the Twilight Zone, and the episode that came to mind for me was the episode called "Time Enough at Last," and I called it up just to make sure I had it straight in my head. It's one of the most famous Twilight Zone episodes where there's a guy who on his lunch break loves to go read in the bank vault because it's quiet there. And while he's in there one day, there's an H-bomb, and of course the world comes to an end, and he emerges horrified, and he becomes despondent and considers taking his own life, only to realize that the library down the street is still intact and full of books. And as an avid reader, he thinks this is, the way he's going to get through: canned food and books. I've got everything I need. He goes to sit down to peruse this wonderful library full of books and breaks his glasses, and he can't see well anymore, right? It strikes me that, of course, the predicament that we're in feels about as serious in some ways as what he found himself dealing with. There's something of a metaphor maybe in the idea that all the information available in the world is available at our fingertips, but without the tools to make sense of any of it, we feel despondent and lost, almost ready to give up hope. And I think that's one of the things about the semantic environment that comes up anytime we do a panel like this, is the idea that we live in this cacophony of information, the information glut, this vortex of confusion. And it strikes me that one of the key turns that's come as a result of this condition is a perpetual sense of confusion and disorientation. And that what Trump does in this atmosphere is he acts as sort of an archetype. I mean, he emerges from our collective psyche, this vortex of our feelings exploding out into space, and we're all overwhelmed by. And he, more than anyone else, breaks through the cacophony and makes himself the center of conversation. I would say that the other person that has the same skill set, puzzlingly to many people, is Kim Kardashian. Is that the Kardashians are sort of the quintessential figures of this new information age of the 21st century, because they didn't achieve their status in any way by merit, and by merit in the sense that we all understand it from sort of our position in prior information environments, as people who have written or published something or accomplished something in the arts or the sciences. Is that these are people who were able to break through this sort of cacophony of imagery and personality to shape an entire culture around their whenever they're eating breakfast or whatever it is. And Trump is very much the same kind of figure. Is that in this sea of confusion, the only name on our lips almost constantly is Donald J. Trump. That we either love him or hate him, but you cannot escape him. And over the last 4 years, he's preoccupied our psyche in a way that only can be described as a haunting. I feel like we've had sort of an out-of-body experience where we're forced to confront something from within, an archetype of narcissism and cruelty and incoherence and these kind of things. The thing that we fear, especially as folks with education, as folks who are socialized in a print environment, that's a terrifying prospect for us. And yet for people who are not socialized in the same way we are, whose interiors are not like ours, there may be something archetypal that's worth looking up to. There's sort of a cult of personality in this sense that makes him an admirable figure of sorts. And that was sort of the first thing that I had on my mind about where we are in our semantic environment. And, maybe general semantics are the glasses that we need to find in order to make sense of all of it again. The second thing that I had on my mind was something that I read recently, and I'm going to sort of turn my attention to a tab that I had open. There was a link floating around in social media that I happened to click, and it's a piece on the idea of, what's the name of this? Municipalism. I'm not going to get into the particulars of municipalism, except in this piece, much of which I disagree with. There's an interesting point about how our political process is mainly rhetorical. Is that the structure is never in question in a sense, and that The remaking of our politics from time to time is completely a rhetorical remaking, where you have various people who call themselves Greens or socialists or conservatives or whatever the flavor of the month is, and the promise of change is often simply rhetorical change. It's a bunch of talking points. It's a party platform. It's a way to conduct debates that satisfies the media's urge to provide content to the masses, theater. And there's this one paragraph that I think is interesting. It has echoes of Jacques Ellul and Lewis Mumford, as a matter of fact. It says, "It is precisely such parliamentary and ministerial objectives that we call politics today. To the modern political imagination, politics is precisely a body of techniques for holding power in representative bodies, notably the legislative and executive arenas, not a moral calling based on rationality, community, and freedom." And that one paragraph stood out to me a lot, because it feels a lot like all of our arguments, all of our confusion, all of the noise around our politics is simply a noise about the techniques of keeping power. What are legitimate means of holding power? What is the civil way to hold power? For people who see power as the only end, they're playing a game with us, and we're sort of losing that game because we're not focused on. I mean, I'll sort of wrap with this: the idea that Mitch McConnell is laughing at all of us for thinking that there's something called civil politics or that there's parliamentary procedure. I mean, there's only power. There's only a cynical power grab, and our sort of American wrapped in the flag ideals feels hurt by this whole thing. But if you look at these totalitarian regimes around the world, there is only power. There's only the acquisition and control of power that matters in the end. And we've moved in that direction. Is that the filibuster is a quaint old artifact of orality, and we don't even practice it anymore. We can just simply say, "I filibuster," and the game is up. All of these techniques have led us down a path where our sensibilities about what democracy is and what fairness is and what justice is and what the law is are simply theatrical rhetoric. And the reality is, for those people who hold power at the moment, there is only a cynical means to an end, regardless of what we call it or how we practice it.
Thank you, Mike. And I wanted to add a couple of comments. Just a note that when Tom brought up the effort to trigger Biden's stuttering, it just made me realize that one of the main proponents of general semantics, following Korzybski, Wendell Johnson, I believe he was a stutterer himself, and he was certainly very much concerned with that. In fact, his initial area was speech pathology, and I was trying to apply general semantics to that. So I think there's an interesting connection there. But I wanted to note, Postman had a cute phrase that he coined after there was a book title called "The Meaning of Meaning" by C.K. Ogden and I.A. Richards. So Postman came up with the demeaning of meaning, and that we demean our significant symbols either by repetition or using them in trivial ways. And I couldn't help thinking from some of the comments about how Trump uses these terms like fake news and hoax to the point where they lose their meaning, and that rigged the point that Kathy made, that also gets used over and over, and that repetition just empties them of all meaning. And I have to say, one thing that really bugs me, and it comes more from the journalists, is that they somehow adopted, and I think it comes out of dealing with Trump, they adopted the gambling term "double down" for when any candidate tries to emphasize something or amplify a strategy, and they say they doubled down. And it really bugs me because it's a gambling metaphor. And so behind it is that idea that it's just a game. And we look at it as a game, it's sort of the question, what are the metaphors we're working with? And if politics is a game, then what Mike brought up about it's gaming the system. What McConnell does, for example, it's just finding the most efficient way to use the rules to your advantage rather than trying to play in this sort of normative, fair and square kind of way. And it's the same way that when Trump says, well, I didn't pay any taxes, that's because I'm smart. It's a game. And the game is, the IRS is your enemy. You're playing a game, and the idea is to win that game by paying as little as possible, rather than, an alternate metaphor of, say, civic duty as, an alternate framework for that. So maybe I'd throw this out to you is, when you talk about the semantic environment, one of the things we're talking about are the metaphors that are in play. And, what do you see as the, significant metaphors for good or for ill that are in play at this moment?
I'd like to just pick up on what you just said, because the idea of gaming the system and making politics a game and making civil society a game suggests a kind of nihilism on the Republicans' part, and especially Trump's part. They don't care about the values. They just care about what he likes to call winning. And in a sense, it's a kind of television show writ large. It has nothing to do with the content or anything. It has just something to do with the way it turns out, or how cool the hero can look as he games the system. And you spoke about how his repetition of certain terms demeans them in a sense and creates a real lack of meaning. I think that's one of his strengths as a propagandist. There's this overwhelming amount of information, this welter of information, and he says the same thing with the same 7 or 8 words constantly. And that gets through because because the media environment, the semantic environment generally confuses people. And one of the things that they know what Trump says, at least they know what he says. So in that way, his message gets through.
Okay.
Sal, I want to pick up on that because I think part of what we've seen is kind of different art forms. In fact, I mentioned in the chat, Roderick Hart has a book out, I think this month, about Trump and us and why we should listen to Trump. And part of his argument is that Trump has turned the rant into an art form. So in addition to creating a vocabulary that we're familiar with that gets through the chaos and the overload of information, he's created or has perfected this form of persuasion.
Right.
The other thing is that he's created a vocabulary of his own. Whether we're used to things like this is fantastic, the best, it's a disgrace. We're used to his terminology. It's phenomenal, it's strong. People are saying, and there are actually, online there are there are glossaries for some of his terms that have broken through, as you suggest. So everybody's talking about it. Well, what does that mean? It really means nobody's talking about it except him, or that's what people are saying. Well, nobody said it. He said it. He made it up. Walking out to the microphone. Nobody knows more about this than I do. He literally knows nothing. We're going to find out, or this is what I've heard. I mean, we've heard these phrases over and over again. The media is a disgrace. I won't even go into, I have a very large brain and the best words. But I'm a stable genius. We've heard these things, and that's kind of broken through. One of the things that I want to get at, though, in terms of the semantic environment, is who is it breaking through to? Because I think some of these phrases have broken through to the general population. There are other phrases that only break through to a select audience. The dog whistles. A dog whistle is not heard by everybody. A dog whistle is heard by a dog. And so if you go back to some of the language and some of the criticism of his performance in the last debate, of Trump's performance in the last debate, well, he didn't break through to everybody when he used kind of dog whistles or coded language when he talked about the briefcase and the laptop. Well, that was coded language for people who are living in the right-wing media bubble, who have been hearing about stories about Hunter Biden and some of the supposedly planted disinformation about Biden's son. So I think that the question of not only what language is breaking through, but who is it breaking through to? How much coded language is there? How much are we dealing with dog whistles? Trump isn't the only one using dog whistles or coded language. Biden talking, for example, about the dignity of work. Well, that's coded language for people who grew up in the Catholic Church. So there are lots of examples of throughout modern presidential rhetoric that deals with this kind of coded language. But I think, well, to piggyback off of Rod Hart's point, I think that Trump has turned it into an art form.
Yeah. Yeah, because the emotion is more important than what is said.
Or the affect, performance.
The affect, right.
I have a totally different metaphor, and that's disruption.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this Harvard business professor, a guy named Clayton Christensen, who wrote a book late 90s, I think it was 1997, based on an article that he had written, which originally was published in the Harvard Business Review. Even Harvard faculty, write in their own publications, right? And this guy, and by the way, he passed away this year, and I wish him no ill will, but his influence on industry, particularly in Silicon Valley and Silicon Alley, was immense and led to business practices like Uber. The taxi industry was a problem. You had to stand out in the street and had to pay by cash and figure out what the tip was, and all these problems that made it so problematic that we had to replace it with Uber and Lyft. And, hotels were so expensive to stay in, and motels, so we have to have Airbnb. We have to have this new business to disrupt.
Yeah.
And so an important part of the Trump candidacy, and you can't forget this, was Steve Bannon. Right. And Steve Bannon, who talks about the fact that his father lost a great deal of his wealth and retirement in investing it. Right. And sort of just, that marked him, and he wanted to make up for that, not just by becoming successful himself, working for Goldman Sachs and being an investor and a producer for the Seinfeld program and all this stuff. Right? He comes along and he attaches himself to this campaign with the idea that he is going to bring about a change that is necessary in the contemporary age. And really, his political he's an anarchist. All he wanted to do was tear everything down. There's no end game beyond that. And so it's really interesting that this idea of disruption expands beyond industry and business and expands into our political culture. And I don't think it's disconnected from the fact that Trump is not the only authoritarian who came to power and came to power with this idea that, oh, he's a populist. Oh, give me a break. None of them are populists.
Can I piggyback on that? Because, and this has been very much in the forefront of my thinking. This is what we were doing in class this week. So I'm taking my class notes with me. But it's not only the concept of disruption, it's disruptive technologies. And so the disruptive technologies or technological uses. So it's disruptive technologies of the computer, the disruptive technologies of mobile phones, the disruptive use of technology in terms of social media. And so we can't talk about this election campaign without talking about the virtual environment. Look where wherever we are meeting. We can't ignore the power, particularly of social media. Trump has said over and over again that he would not be where he is today, but for social media. We have a situation where we're dealing with the first, even though Obama was certainly social media savvy, Trump is really the first, tweeter in chief. I can go back to litigation that actually establishes, that his unprecedented use of his personal social media accounts is now, for official government purposes, is now legally recognized as part of the public forum. So, we in terms of disruptive technologies, we're looking at a social media environment where, in terms of the election, Trump is a native or a denizen of the social media environment, of that disruptive environment. He's got 85 million Twitter followers. He's got 30 million Facebook followers. And in terms of the election campaign, Biden is playing catch up. He's got 3 million followers on Facebook. He's got 9 million followers on Twitter. It doesn't come naturally to him. He's not up at 3 o'clock in the morning tweeting whatever comes out of those little fingers. So and even if we look at political advertising, up until recently, the Trump campaign saw the cheap advertising opportunities in social media as being the place to be. I think that understanding the disruptive technological environment of social media and the role that plays, and in terms of the semantic environment, I don't want to take too much time, but we can talk about the semantic environment of the social media world and the moderators of that environment that were up on Capitol Hill yesterday. And so you're talking about moderating that environment where every social media outlet has a terms of service that list what is hate speech, what are threats, what's allowed, what's not allowed, what warrants a takedown. So that semantic environment, I think, as a mediated semantic environment that is controlled and moderated, and potentially after yesterday regulated, that has to be part of this equation too, this conversation too.
I would just want to jump in for a second because we're talking so much about Trump. And I have been looking very carefully for the last 4 years or 5 years at the Democratic Party. And we've not really been talking about the Democrats. And if we're talking about the issue of power, how power is played, how power is manipulated, the semantic environment, and you look at the Republican side where they're on lockstep with one another, and then then you look at the Democrats, where less than a month ago, AOC, who I think is very interesting. I actually worked with the Nation and the Blue Wave. Marty and I made phone calls all across country, including for Queens, including for all the women who came in as first timers. But AOC said with less than a month to go for the election, she made the announcement that, well, if we had a different system, I wouldn't even be in the same party with Biden. So I think we have a problem in terms of, as a Democratic Party and a semantic environment, we are not very good strategists. And I think we have priority issues. And I'm not sure how we are going to be able to get on board with those, because we can keep pointing our fingers over and over and over again at Trump. And he was already pointed out 4 years ago as being a major problem, and that still did not get people out to vote. Whether it was constantly saying things like, well, this was going to be a rigged election, so that everybody went, okay, rigged, I can't do anything about it, which I heard a good number of people saying, or whether it was my candidate didn't get it, I'm not voting, or I'm going to throw a cocktail in there and blow up the system because I don't agree with what has happened. And we have very real things to think about now. Those power plays, those minute power plays coming from the left, my brethren, also now gave us the court that we have now. It's not just Mitch McConnell. It's because we as a party and a group were not prioritizing, and we were not thinking further ahead in terms of what was important and then how we can move to progressive goals. And I have some real problems. And so not only do I have the issue with Trump and McConnell and all the things that they're doing, not as much, but I have almost equal shade for my fellow Dems.
And just to clarify, when you say we, you mean we Democrats, us Democrats?
Yes, because I situated myself as being a Democrat, and we've been going Trump, but we lost the election last time.
Yeah,
and
yeah. I just wanted to make sure that's clear to the audience.
Yes.
I know Mike wants to say something.
So I thought it was interesting. We did talk Trump, and now we've talked Trump and Democrats, and sort of to bring it back a little bit to Lance's initial point about media, about the media, right? Trump has been successful at branding our press as fake news, right? It's just, everybody knows this like it's the back of their hand at this point. And, it strikes me that he's been quite effective with that, because people who support him are quite willing to buy into the fact that these are just a bunch of lies. And that's, I think, oversimplified thinking, of course, but it's not necessarily wrong thinking per se. I think on the left, there's perhaps a bit more nuance about what's wrong with the media. We had Jay Rosen as our keynote speaker at the Media Ecology Association convention this summer, and he gave us quite a shocking and interesting diagnosis of the problem. But I think, one of the reasons that everything feels like it's falling down, regardless of what side you're on, is because that sort of central pillar, the Walter Cronkite pillar, the pillar of the trusted sort of news establishment is missing, because one side has painted it as fake news and the other side has pointed out how the entertainment and theater dimension of this news project has overtaken any sense of civic or moral responsibility. And to the idea of the game, the use of metaphor about games in particular, we see all of these sort of underhanded strategies about how you have the Republican Party, and at least if you pay attention to the polling for what that's worth these days, it seems as though they're going to lose the presidency, the Senate, and the House. And I mean, if you pay attention to the polling and purely by the polling, and there's a sense now that the only way that they're either going to win or that they're going to make it difficult is to do all of these sort of underhanded tricks, voter suppression, slowing the mail, and all these things. And the way that the news covers this is interesting, because rather than calling it a coup, rather than calling it what it actually is an attempt to throw a coup of the democratic electoral process, the press calls it Republican strategy. And it's interesting to me how they can't filter any of these kind of shameful, immoral, undemocratic kinds of strategy or tactics as anything other than sort of strategies in a game. Is that, you know, power is a game, and at the top of the game is whoever could strategize a way to grab power the best. And, you know, if you're the fourth estate and your position is not, the house is on fire and the entire system is in terrible peril, then you're derelict in your duty. And I think that's probably what we ought to be focusing on more than any of the little machinations of the parties, is the fact that the watchdog is dead, that the watchdog has eaten the steak and is asleep on the porch, however you want to say it. But I think the watchdog is in serious shape. And I think until we figure out a way to hold them accountable better for the kind of framing, these kind of, I mean, we talk about this all the time as comm scholars. And, you know, I work with my students all the time on research projects around agenda setting and framing theory and these things. But what does it amount to when we do all this research? It's just a handful of us reading these in journals in order to get tenure and so forth. These things are the critical democratic issues of our time. And until we actually figure out practical ways to take what we know about these processes and actually make an impact on the system itself, what we're doing is just walking blind down the street into something terrifying, I think.
It's really interesting, real quick, to watch George Clooney's movie Good Night and Good Luck about Edward R. Murrow. And really what's most interesting about it to me is all of the backstory stuff as they're talking about the pressures that they're going to face as they try to bring McCarthy down, which is to say the politics, well, they weren't as virulent as they are now, but the politics were still a concern with respect to their reporting. And you know, to go back to that quaint time, right? Television journalism, right? To go back to that quaint time and compare it to now, I think is really instructive and really interesting.
Can I just follow up on that? Because there are a couple of points. One is, in terms of fake news, it's an age-old allegation. Russell Chun and I, my colleague, just came out with an edited volume on fake news, tracing the history, looking at it internationally, and then, of course, the unique thing of what it means to Trump, which is anything that reflects badly on him is fake. That's not the traditional definition of fake news. We can, you know, go back to concepts like the big lie, look back at the derivation of the word propaganda. I mean, there are all sorts of ways of looking at and slicing and dicing fake news now. But in terms of the point about where we are in the state of journalism, I would argue that journalism has kept us going for the last 4 years, that we are in some kind of a renaissance of investigative journalism. What would we have known as a result of the Mueller report? What would we have known as a result of any of the investigations? It pales by comparison to what we have gotten out of stellar investigative journalism that's being done now. Now that the stories may be lost in the semantic environment that we're in the sheer power and entertainment force that is Trump, because he can suck the air out of any room and any news cycle that exists, which may be one of his greatest talents. But the issue of where journalism is today, I think that they're in a high point. There's an apex of investigative journalism. I just saw an interview today with Susan Zirinsky, who is the president of CBS News. And she was being interviewed about the Trump walk-off and both the Trump-Pence interviews and walk-off of Leslie Stahl interview on 60 Minutes last week, and then comparing that to the interviews that Biden and Harris gave for the same 60 Minutes episode. And she was giving kind of a behind the scenes of what they did to prepare for their coverage, and a little story about, how shocked all of the crew was actually when he walked off and what the reactions were. But interestingly, Tom, in terms of your point about good night, good luck, she said that before, in this interview, and it was done with Walter Isaacson on PBS, on Christian Poor's program, she said that before they went into, at CBS News, before they went into the election campaign coverage, and particularly this last 60 Minutes episode where they bring the 4 candidates out that had the ticket, they watch episodes of the Army McCarthy hearings. They watch episodes of Murrow, and they talk about what journalism was at that time. So they're steeped in that as they're going into trying to cover this, whatever this is right now.
Of course, there's the whole worship of Edward R. Murrow in broadcast journalism. I'm sorry, Kathy, what were you?
No, I do agree with Susan. I'm a fan of MSNBC. My favorite, Joy Reid and Lawrence O'Donnell, they have used the words coup, and they have gone after the Trump organization, the McConnell, and so forth, and so on. So I think we do have people who are really standing up. And I think it has become a very interesting heyday where the New York Times is having more subscriptions, both even just paper and online. And so I think that is very important for journalism. The question for me is that if you have someone delivering, or the ability to deliver, all of this incredible entertainment value, then what does the side that I'm on do in order to get that type of attention and in order to sway regular voters? I think finally people have turned to the issues, but I think we really need to do a scalpel approach to find out what really has worked and how we can air our differences without pulling the party apart, which is what I think happened last time.
Well, that's, when you say that, we get back to that point of image politics and entertainment, and Mike was bringing up, Jay Rosen's point is that however good they're doing, they don't know how to cover Trump. They don't know how to deal with him. When we, I think, Sue, when you talk about journalism, you're not talking about Fox or let alone OAN or those folks. And that goes back to Mike's earlier point about information glut. That leads to it. But I wanted to also connect to Kathy's earlier point about parties, because if we, say that, there's a somewhat of a disruption of journalism that really social media represents, as well as proliferation of outlets through the internet and cable channels, but that parties themselves have been disrupted, and that Trump was the ultimate disruptor of the Republican Party. You got to say, God bless those guys at the Lincoln Project, but at the same time, they're terrifying because, turning that kind, if you've seen their ads, they're devastating. But those are it's the same kind of ads that gave us, like the Willie Horton ad for George H.W. Bush and the swift boating of John Kerry. Yeah. But it's like parties have pretty much been disrupted. So when Bernie said, it's a rigged primary, really what he was saying is that the Democratic Party still wasn't completely hollowed out and still was going to have some say, but the and it almost paradoxically, because the Republican Party was always the one that was less open, and yet they were completely disrupted by Trump's candidacy and completely taken over. It was a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. And if you think about it, it's not in the Constitution. It's not part of our democracy that we have a two-party system. And so much of our politics, and our faith in our system relies on the fact of these they're private institutions, political parties. They're not public. And we depend on them to act in a faithful manner and present us with candidates that are worthy of the office. And instead we get, it's not just Trump, we got Arnold Schwarzenegger. Maybe he wasn't that bad, I don't know. But we've gotten other really strange candidates coming out of the system.
Well, you're pointing out something that's been a trend, really, right? The Republicans, that hostile takeover by Trump was due to a couple of factors. One is George Bush had really destroyed the Republican Party. The war in Iraq was a disaster, one of the worst decisions a president ever made, besides Trump's decision to ignore the pandemic or to allow the pandemic to kill people he didn't like. So there was a real attack here on the Republican Party from within and from without. And Trump was able to waltz through. I don't think he lost the primary, if I'm not mistaken. The Democrats, of course, to Kathy's point, they've been a disaster. They don't understand class warfare. And one of the things, I don't think the country understands class warfare. McConnell certainly understands class warfare. And that's one of the things we hesitate to talk about class, in this semantic environment. We hesitate to talk about it because it's difficult. It's much easier to simply say, well, I'm middle class, or those kinds of things. But believe me, Trump and his ilk do not see us as middle class. They see us as somebody they can exploit. And one of the things about Trumpism is that it's not gone even when Trump leaves. The idea that the economy is more important than human life, the fact that it's reified to the extent that it is agreed to by 40% and more of the public.
It's scary.
Can I throw this out there in response? So a real force since the collapse, the repeal, of the fairness doctrine, has been the rise of conservative talk radio, epitomized, of course, by Rush Limbaugh, who is suffering from lung cancer. And a couple of years back, I'm trying to remember exactly when, a bunch of liberal Democrats got together to create a left of center response to the power of conservative talk radio. They created a network called Air America, right? And it was Al Franken and Janine Garofalo and a whole bunch of investors.
Rachel Maddow.
Yeah. And it totally flopped.
Yeah.
Right? And so my take on the flop was always that, the Republican ideologues speak to your values, these deep set values that were, given down to you from your parents and their parents, right? And they're always speaking to that. And people who are liberals, right? Think of the definition of the word. They're free thinkers, and they see the black and white, but they see the gray and all the colors in between. And they want to talk about ideas, and no one wants to listen to that.
See, I would go further.
Conversation.
I'd go further. I'd say McLuhan had the answer to that, because the form of the medium is easier for simple sound bites, whether it's television or whether it's radio. And that really helps conservatives. Conservatives don't want to get too complicated. Liberals like to get complicated.
Yeah, I was going to raise that a little bit. I think that I think that the nature of the media environment now is towards the personal. All politics are personal. And that's why Trump it's so easy for him to break through. Either love or hate, it feels personal. You either loathe the person, like you want to throttle him, or you want to embrace him. And one way or the other, you don't have a soft feeling about him. All politics are personal. And to the extent that one of the parties has a personality, because Trump has swallowed the entire Republican Party and lent it his personality, that's what breaks through. And for the Democrats, there's no personality. What is the personality of the Democratic Party, right? We've replaced party with Trumpism, because that's a sort of a personality type. But we haven't replaced the Democratic Party with some sort of personality type. We've tried, like the followers of Bernie Sanders sort of have a hybrid policy, personality kind of infatuation with him. But for the most part, they're like, no one really wants to vote for Joe Biden. Right? I've seen one Joe Biden sign.
Sorry.
I mean, I've seen one Joe Biden sign, one, in all of Westchester County as I've driven around. And I see Trump, fuck your feelings, Trump, no more bullshit, plastered on houses like it's Halloween. Yeah. And that strikes me as being a different level of enthusiasm, one that we have not achieved with this candidate, and we haven't achieved very successfully, really, with the exception of Barack Obama. Maybe we can say Bill Clinton had something like that sort of personality with his saxophone, but it feels a lot more like the type of projection of personality that's required to be successful in politics in 2020 eclipses anything that we've seen before, although this phenomenon might stretch back as far as television goes, maybe radio with FDR.
Okay, I'm going to...
People are tired of it. I think people are tired of the personality. And I think you're seeing that in the voters. And come out to the Hamptons. There are lots of Biden-Harris signs. You'll be very surprised. So I think it has to do with where you're located as well, rather than making, a big general splash. And also this to me is exactly, forgive me, you're such a wonderful speaker, but forgive me, this is part of the problem with the Democratic Party. We have people stating, well, who wants to vote for Joe Biden? And then
I'm only a Democrat
wait a minute.
Sure.
Or is not Hillary so unattractive? Is she not? Everybody hates her. And this goes on and on. So it comes from without and it comes from within, and not everyone feels as you do. So you're speaking very much from your point of view. Not everyone feels that way. There are so many people in this country that are center. For those of us who move progressive, there are so many people that are center. That's Republican center. That's Democratic center. Sure. And right now, that's probably where we need to move strategically to get rid of the orange clown.
I just wanted to finish.
No, stop. I got to stop now, because we really need to go to the question and answer part of the program, because time is running out. Tom, you wanted to do that part, or you want me to do that part? You're muted, Tom.
Do you have access to the Q&A? Can you see that?
Yeah, I do.
Oh, go for it. Go for it.
Okay. Then Gary Gumpert asks whether Trump is more entertaining than Biden.
Of course he is. Of course he is. And if you live in an entertainment state, it's one of the reasons why I think Michael was actually pointing this out. It's one of the reasons why he's so popular. I mean, he's really doing his comedy act. Mm-hmm. He's perfect for people who are low involvement voters, who don't care about policy, who don't want to understand the complexity of the economy. And if you want to laugh and make fun of somebody, which is what they do. I mean, we do live in a kind of troll nation, and he's, the troll in chief, really, then he's your guy.
Mm-hmm.
I still think that I really do think that the majority does no longer wants to amuse themselves to death. I think they've had Trump, and I think we're moving on. I really, really believe that. The majority. I think he's got a base.
If you take celebrity logic, it's called overexposed.
Thank you.
I think that he's a product of celebrity culture. He rose to where he is and for those of us in New York, we saw him through the 80s and the 90s, building that brand of celebrity. Then he took it to NBC, and now he's taken it to the world. And so hopefully it is overexposure, but he is a product of this. We got the celebrity in chief.
Okay.
Taking it to the world, literally. And
Okay. Next question that I'll go to is from Caitlin Hamilton. What do you think about Twitter and Facebook's fact-checking barriers on many videos and even complete censorship of supposed false information? Good or bad? Is it a way of sustaining certain types of power?
Well, that's certainly been under scrutiny yesterday on Capitol Hill. It's an effort legally within their authority. You're not talking about, a public forum owned by the government. So legally they have the right to moderate, and they have the right to determine what kind of environment they want. Certainly outside the United States, they have been much more pressured by regulators, places like Germany and France, Australia, to keep an eye on that environment and to either label or take down. I think what's really interesting right now is that the effort to monitor, and this has just really been in the last couple of weeks, the effort to monitor may end up costing them their special status, their Section 230 immunity from liability for content that is posted. So that was supposed to be what the hearings on Capitol Hill were about yesterday. Why the heads of Facebook and Twitter and Google were being grilled. There was an executive order because Trump felt that the labeling was anti-conservative and anti-Trump. And so he signed an executive order and started tweeting, threatening the repeal of Section 230 immunity from lawsuits. None other than Justice Clarence Thomas last week was very upset, voiced his displeasure with the fact that the High Court didn't take a case that could have conceivably done away with Section 230 protections. And now the head of the FCC last Friday said that he would look into a change in rulemaking. So, I mean, this is all the idea of what role the social media outlets play and what potential liability they could have in trying to maintain some honesty or at least some even if fact checking isn't infallible, at least notifying and labeling that this is questionable. You may want to look at this. That may cost them mightily if they lose that kind of immunity from lawsuits.
It's going to cost them mightily because they don't want to believe that they're in the news business. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, they are the largest distributors of news or news stories or headlines or whatever you want to call it. And they don't want to have an editorial. They don't want to have a layer of editorial folks to overlook the news. I mean, but I agree with you that the hearings this past week were basically, a publicity stunt. I mean, you had Senator Mike Lee, this conservative from wherever, Utah, says that fact checking you shouldn't be able to fact check my tweets. Now, there's a guy who wants to have his propaganda, and he doesn't want his propaganda played around with. Mm-hmm. So they understand Facebook and Twitter better than Dorsey and whoever, Zuckerberg. Right. They understand what Facebook is. And those guys still see it as something else.
Let me move on, and this is a topic we haven't really dealt with before, but it relates to Kate Carney wants to take us back to the talk about the word rigged, and wants to ask if we would say that the expedited nomination and confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett could be considered rigged. Would this word be applicable to situations that seem lawfully acceptable at the surface, but are in fact politically motivated in a dangerous way? And why can't the media call this rigging?
Right. Why won't they call it rigging?
Well,
Let's let Kathy.
Kathy.
That's her word.
yes, I think that you make the questioner made an excellent point. My larger point is that if we just simply label everything rigged, then we're not paying attention to the actual problem and what we can do to fix it. For example, if we have court packing, we have to really think about court packing. If we have elections as Democrats coming up and we see that there are going to be openings on a court, then maybe you're going to vote for a candidate that you might not be so enthusiastic about because you are thinking down the road. If you just make the complaint rigged, it often doesn't go anywhere. So I can say rigged for any number of things and then I'm done. I can wrap myself in the progressive flag and I don't have to think, and then I'm done. And this is what I think has been a problem with the Democratic Party. You're very right. What he did constitutionally, I suppose you could say that they had the right to do it, but they were doing it ethically and morally during the time that we were voting. And as far as Tom's expose on hypocrisy, that is, of course, the perfect example. So thank you so much for that question.
Okay.
Yeah, the confirmation is a further not mistake, but it's a further problem. I mean, they refused to give Merrick Garland a hearing.
Yeah, they did because they could. Because they could. It's about power.
And
that's why Democrats need to be strategic instead of holding up your nose and going, "Oh, I don't want to be in this party with this person," and "Oh, blah blah blah." What about the policies? Think about policies going forward and where the country's going to move at this moment, so we can move there and then move where we want to go. If we never get there, we're not going to. Now, one of the worst things that has happened now, that to me will be rigging in the future, is with the court packed the way it is, the Supreme Court, we're not going to overturn Citizens United. You explain to me how we're going to do that and get corporate money out of the elections. This was Bernie's whole campaign, and yet 12% of his voters voted for Trump and were willing to risk the fact that he could pack the court and make sure that would never happen.
I know,
and I think that the Democrats also have an issue where we're actually using the phrase "pack the court" to talk about a variety of things. Where, in fact, if you look at the last time, there have been a number of times in American history where the number of justices on the Supreme Court have increased, and so the number 9, for example, might just seem arbitrary to us. But in fact, I believe, and maybe Susan is an expert with this, I'm sure, that the 9 justices correspond to the 9 federal districts, and that in 2020 we have 13 federal districts. Is that there was sort of a symmetry in the way that the court was staffed, for lack of a better word. And so if we talk about it, when the Democrats win in order to combat Trump's strategery, we're going to pack the court. Well, that sounds like a rigging strategy, right? It sounds like rigging rather than rooting it in an actual tradition of jurisprudence where we have a certain number of justices corresponding to a certain number of federal districts, for example.
Yeah, well, I think that on that point, that it's more that tends to be more the other side that uses that term packing,
right.
And it's not used for what the Republicans are doing in terms of stacking the court in their favor. But I do want to move on to the next question. Again, just because we have a lot of them. And Maddie McCoy asks about Trump's style, that he often tries to use the fact that he's not a politician to his advantage. For example, during the last debate, he criticized Biden for only saying things people want to hear because he's a politician, and that's what they do. It's sort of ironic, of course, from coming from Trump as a president. Instead, Trump claimed that he's better because, quote unquote, he's not a politician and somehow understands people's needs better because of this. Do you think this tactic of trying to prove his rawness or realness is effective, or do people see through this?
I think it was very effective for about 40% of the public. He appears as a truth teller. He appears as somebody who is a pox on both your houses, when in fact, that is not the case. The Democrats were wrong, or they engaged in some sort of malpractice by not pointing that out. I mean, what was stunning about that exchange in the debate was that Biden didn't have an answer for him.
When you say they didn't point it out, I mean, again, let's go back to good night and good luck. Let's go back to Edward R. Murrow. Realize that Murrow and Friendly buried McCarthy by letting him talk.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a key difference between then and now, that, you know, the Democrats do take him on, but the fact is that people, when we let him talk, people don't see the fact that we've come this far away from what is normal and what should be and what is appropriate, etc.
Okay, so let's go into appropriate. Part of what he does is not only say that he's not a politician and he gets what you're going through and the populist message. Part of what he does part of what he does in terms of authenticity is that, to go back to the semantic environment, he is the profanity president. You know, there are interviews that he's given and statements that he's made that parents don't want their children to hear. There are times where he has said things that, you know, C-SPAN has bleeped him. And so not that presidents prior to this haven't used salty language, but there's been this profanity-laden approach to his language that I think he uses as a way to appear authentic.
Yeah.
That I'm using language that everybody else would use. I'm not playing the presidential game. I don't engage in president speak. And therefore I'm real, I'm authentic, I get you, I'm psychologically closer to you. And I think part of his profanity is
very clever propaganda technique.
It also excuses anything that he does wrong.
Right. It's very clever. But obscenity in political language, or obscenity in the public sphere, has a long and interesting history. There was a time when you couldn't say the F word. You wouldn't say the F word. And today, apparently, if you don't use salty language, right, if you don't engage in that kind of rhetoric, then you're not seen as real. So, there's an interesting history about this.
Where it used to be an open mic and a mistake.
Right.
It's out front.
Right.
Now, a couple of students have asked about questions that relate to the power of media. So Nick Tessalides asks, how big of a role do you think that the news media play in swaying the average American voter? And Casey Brown asks, has the media from both sides divided our nation more than ever before? Really, they're both asking, are they really having this effect? And I suppose, part of the alternative is, are they just a reflection of where we're at? What are your views on that?
Well, here's the thing. Obviously, the media is fragmented and reflects the polarization of the nation, but it's asymmetrical. The liberal media, let's call it the liberal media, is way more diverse in their reporting than the conservative media. Yochai Benkler, he's at the Institute for the Internet, I forget what it's called, at Harvard, wrote this book, Network Propaganda, in which he explains a lot of this. And with charts, which is really good. And the charts are particularly revelatory because they show how folks, liberals, get a wide variety of news sources and conservatives don't. So the polarization only appears because CNN wants to say both sides do it. But both sides do not do it.
That's right.
And the second part of that, just to finish this, is that whether you're a liberal news medium, news agency, or a conservative news agency, the horse race is everything. And that takes center stage at this point. And the drama becomes what they want to report.
Okay.
Again, just in terms of the media environment, it's not just about reporting. It's a media environment where I know my students who are journalism students are not reading newspapers, online or physically. They're getting their news from social media. And so is it reporting and the posting and reposting or tweeting and linking to news stories? Or, I mean, we can go back to the two-step flow. Is it what they're getting in conversations and posts and memes, the power of memes we haven't discussed? Is that what's driving the news cycle in a social media environment?
And the Russians have all those disinformation farms, right? And they create all kinds of messages on Facebook and Twitter in order to polarize people. I mean, I remember 2016, they put out a meme that said, Pope Francis supports Donald Trump. You know what I mean? Who would believe that? But then again,
Or Dr. Fauci.
it might be somebody.
When you talk about social media and we talk about the semantic environment, I want to give it a different term. I want to call it the algorithmic environment.
Oh.
And what the Russian troll farms are doing is that they understand how to manipulate the algorithm. Now, what's important about this, and again, I'll say it real quick because I know there are other questions, is, so McLuhan told us, right, the medium is invisible, right? We think about content and we miss the influence of the medium on its content, right? We don't think of the difference between the news on MSNBC and the news in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. That's journalism. It's all right. But the medium makes it. But when you start to talk about the algorithm that drives social media and why hiring a bunch of people who will flag things and who will be the censors is just insane. There's so much content being created, is that there's another level of invisibility underneath this all that is really what controls it.
Well, we have another question from Paige Hoffman about the comment that Trump is a social media native and Biden is playing catch up. And is this solely because Trump has been president for 4 years, so he had a head start on Biden, or is he just more invested in the social media environment?
He also has a lot of bots.
I think Trump's sort of rhetorically aligned with the 280 character kind of format already. The way he speaks out loud, his thoughts are organized in bites like that. I think it's obvious when he stands up there and tries to speak extemporaneously that lots of non sequiturs and very odd kinds of formulations come out. But that's really useful on social media. You blast something out there and it only has to half make sense. You could always follow it up with some other crazy thing that somewhat clarifies it and somewhat draws the audience in waiting for more. And Biden is a literate person. Biden did have sort of a plagiarism charge in his past, I remember. But I mean, he is a product deeply rooted in sort of this
Bible culture.
Yeah, I mean, Biden is an interesting person with a long sort of record of legislating and speechifying and all these kinds of things. And he's a person who's been rooted deeply in the nature of the establishment, which is a print sort of based environment. And he doesn't think that way, and therefore he has people probably help him channel his thoughts into more digestible little bites. But then again, so is everybody else through television and radio and the rest up to this point. Trump just happens to fit the medium so perfectly. I mean, he stepped right into an environment that welcomed him and amplified him.
Well, maybe as a final question, since our time's running out, Yao and Lu has asked about students, and it's a good question for all of the youngsters in the audience, all you young people there. How should students, he says, how should students like me, not me, but like him, take any part in such a complicated political environment at present and in the future?
Well, I would like to answer that very simply, and that is the way you take part is to participate. If you do not participate, you're not taking part. It may seem strange. It may not be the candidate of your choice. This may not happen. That may not happen. But if you don't jump in, you will never be heard. And you don't allow the imaginary, perfect, and ideal to interfere with the greater good. You can always have a voice. You can always move forward. And once you get a taste, then you can find out where you go. If you always stay from the outside and go, well, I don't know, and it's not perfect for me, and I don't want it, then you're never going to be part of the solution. Come, be part of the solution. Vote, get involved.
Choose a channel.
And then be up here in a discussion instead of us telling us what you have learned and seen.
I would say choose a channel, get involved, participate, what Kathy said, but choose the channel, choose the communication environment in which you're comfortable, in which you can have an effect. So, in days gone by, it might have been knocking on doors. It still is sometimes manning telephones. Are you good in a social media environment? Find the right environment, the communication environment that fits your comfort level, your talents, your skills, and get involved in that way. But the bottom line is participate.
Yeah, I'd like to build on.
Try it out. Go ahead, Sal.
On what Susan just said. You may avoid politics, you may dislike politics, you may run away from politics, but politics is going to come for you.
And I think one of the things that it's a refrain that I use all the time is we don't particularly practice democracy all that much in our lives. There isn't a profile of democracy in our work, in our school, in these various places where we learn to be an adult and learn to be a full person. And if you have the capacity to create more democratic systems wherever you hold power, do so. Because the expansion of democracy into other parts of our lives gives us practice in being better caretakers and better custodians of this sacred thing that we've built. And if we don't do that, there's no real place to practice it. Who's going to expand democracy to make a fairer and more just world, if not you? And that's, I think, an important thing to think about when you get a little taste of power at some point in your life.
Tom, you want to say something on that?
No, that was great. That was
okay. Well, I'd like to invite all of you in the audience to signal your grand approval of this session by typing something applause-like in the chat. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists for really stimulating and, at least for the moment, I would call it even therapeutic discussion. So thank you to Sue, Sal, Kathy, Tom, and Mike. And thank you all for attending this session. Thank you. And we've been recording it, so I'll try to get this up and available as soon as possible. And I just want to comment that I think that Halloween comes right before Election Day, and it just seems quite fitting. So we may have to do another one of these discussions before too long to see where we're at. So thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Lance.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everybody. Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you, questions. Thank you, questioners.